Thank you. If I've learned one thing from the previous speakers, I'm nearly done. The talk I'm going to give is really the traditional legal talk. I'm quite intimidated by the philosophical predecessor. And it's going right down back to South Africa in a very simple context. The Department of Environmental Affairs asked me to give an opinion on the norms and standards and the management plans that are derived from that for elephants, and whether all elephant populations can be subject to those norms and standards. So I took off my ecological hat and put on my legal hat, and off I went with view to advising on the revision of the norms and standards. Whoops. Got to see many slides on here, but I should concentrate on one. Why do we have norms and standards? What is the point of having norms and standards from a legal perspective? And if one scratches around, you'll automatically go back to the Constitution. If I remember correctly, it's 146. I have more of a lawyer than I am on my right. And it says, in some circumstances, you want to bring uniform environmental management across the country. So from an elephant perspective, what was his name, Chris, the farmer? What he does with his elephant is the same as some guy somewhere else does with elephant, and there's uniformity between the two. And that is the overriding principle throughout the norms and standards. If one looks at them very carefully, where do the norms and standards apply? And so, well, protected areas with elephant or game, registered game farms, private areas, and generally private and communal land. And if one squints a little bit, you can say, these are the possessors of elephant. These are the owners. And the owners must apply the norms and standards, and away you go. And away you go means, all right, compile and have adopted an elephant management plan, and then abide by that. So when do you possess or own an elephant? If you're a landowner, when is that? Well, firstly, there's got to be an elephant. Once you have the elephant, okay, then us lawyers come in and say, well, yes, you have an elephant, but it's actually not really yours. Yes, it's on your property and it's walking around freely. We're not talking about captive elephants here, wild, free-ranging elephant. And if one looks at the common law, all game, including elephants, belongs to nobody. It's a property of no one unless somebody comes around and takes possession, takes physical control, grabs that animal, captures it, hunts it, seizes it, and then you can say, it is mine. So the elephant in the room is only yours when you actually recognize it and take hold of it. Okay, but then I've got my elephant. When is it lost? Well, the first one is when you actually give it away, sell it, donate it, and so on. Legal means, and we see that happening, and permits are drafted. Yes, they are. And off go the elephants to your neighbor or somewhere else. The animal escapes, physical control is lost, you've lost your elephant. But not always the case. Okay, the animal escapes, well, did you mark it? Is it really yours? Yes, I put a hole through its ear, I put a tag on it, therefore it's mine. Or I'm the only person in that whole landscape that owns elephant. So therefore those that escape elephant must be mine. And certainly when the elephant do damage and start costing people money, ownership is very quickly resolved. So that common law holds, but not all the time. And this is the complexity of owning an elephant, is that, or game, is that, yes, it's mine, I've marked them, I've done all sorts of things, and the population builds up, and they move off. And we call it escape, but the elephant says, no, I'm going to greener pastures, looking over the fence. And then in common law, we call this thing rewilding. So when animals move out, and us lawyers argue, saying, oh, it's not escapee, that's animals taking back what they had before, and it's not very common in South African law or exercise, you can turn around and say, that is now a res nullis animal, no longer belongs to you. And we found that out at the buffalo leaving one of our state protected areas in the Eastern Cape. It was argued that these aren't just breakouts, they're re-welding, they're recolonizing and so on, and re-establishing their fera naturae, their natural state. Okay, and then of course the final thing is you lose your elephant when it's stolen or somebody goes and shoots it. So I've got my elephant, Hun, the great hunter, comes in and he shoots it. What can I do? I can prosecute him for trespassing, a whole lot of things, but I can't prosecute him for theft. That's his. He's taken ownership of my elephant. So how do we own our animals in extensive or semi-extensive areas? There's no ways we can go and boma or want to go and boma or put our elephants on leashes and say they're ours. So South Africa was very smart, because it was impractical to do that. It brought out the Game Theft Act. And the Game Theft Act essentially says if you put a fence around your property and you get some guy in a green uniform with a logo on it and a blue book, as we heard the other day, and says this area is sufficiently enclosed, there is sufficient security around that property to render your elephants physically controlled. Therefore you have ownership. Well, we think we have ownership. But the important thing is with that act is that if something escapes, you can get it back again. Okay? But, I'll go back to this thing, there is that deception that you can have a sufficiently enclosed property, you can have your beautiful wildlife in there, they grow up, and then particularly with elephant, when we saw, was it this morning, elephant numbers building up, and then there's all these interventions to try and reduce the numbers or slow the rate of increase. But if they break out, they could be considered re-welding, and therefore become res nullis, and somebody else can take ownership of our assets. But nonetheless, the Game Theft Act says, well, you've got your animals on your property, and they move off the property, it's not lost. Importantly, from a legal perspective, the animals move on from Andrew's property onto mine, I can't necessarily take ownership of them. They're still Andrew's. Therefore, from a norms and standards perspective, it's right and proper for them to apply for those animals that are possessed, those in our nature reserves, as well as those ones that escaped. And one looks at the norms and standards and says, what do you do with the animal that escapes? Well, we do this and this and this in our management plan, and all is well. But when you now get technical and start teasing out the norms and standards, it's very silent on, or absolutely silent on, elephants occurring on state land other than protected areas. Now you're looking at me and saying, well, where's that? Our defence force has huge areas with free roaming elephant. They're not subjected to the norms and standards in a management plan. What about unpossessed elephant? I just happen to have my farm, and there's some elephant on it. I've never taken ownership of them. I haven't seized them. They're just doing their own thing, and I'll go and skip my little bokkie every now and then, and I have my braai and my biltong, and all is well. Why must I, as a landowner, have to now develop norms, or apply the norms and standards, develop a management plan for those animals that I really don't want to own, but they're just there, and incur all the costs? And if we force that as a state, that landowner will be running to the lawyers, and the lawyers will be saying, well, get out of town. But also, we've got transboundary, as we heard early on. animals. They're moving in and out of the country, and I happen to be one of these frontier farms. I'm not interested in what happens in Zimbabwe or Botswana and so on. But yes, some of the elephant come and graze at certain times of the year on my land. I'm not worried about it. It's not, nobody is hurt, nobody's harmed. You are getting a reputation. Under these circumstances, us as the state or government says, well, you're going to have to do this, and impose it on these people to say, if you've got an elephant on your property, you're going to have to now deal some costs. Well, I'm going to turn around and say, if I'm that farmer or landowner, and say, well, you're going to have to pay me for that. Why must I take on the costs? And then when one looks at the norms and standards, there's responsibility and accountability. Just because I've got elephant on my property, I don't want to be responsible for them. What happens if they go and kill somebody or trash somebody's property? You know, before the norms and standards, I was fine, and now you want me to take the risk. Not going to happen. So what is the conundrum? There's a large portion of South African elephants that are not managed in terms of the norms and standards. And therefore that component of, or the absence of regulation renders some non-constitutional aspect to the norms and standards. There's no uniformity. So the department then said, well, Andy, is there a back door we can deal with this? How can we bring the uniformity of management to elephant? And they said, well, can you think of things? And you, because of your PhD aspirations at the University of Tilburg, know about sovereignty and public trust. So there is this elephant, and it's in South Africa. Is it a South African elephant? Does it belong to South Africa? Yeah? George, you nodding?
No, I don't know.
Okay, and if we nod it belong to, does belong mean own? It's a good question. I think it's a good question. Okay? Well, it's a bit early. The answer is no. You can't be sovereign. Sovereign is you are the ultimate power to regulate. If you're a trustee in the public trust, you're a trustee. You don't own the trust entity. If you've got your kid's trust, you don't own that trust. You just look after it. So how can we use that and roll up our sleeves and dip down and seize these elephants so we can force norms and standards on it? If we did that, it would be effectively theft. Whoops. So this belongs to nobody also applies to the state. It applies to everybody. That's one thing about 1994. It's so nice because it was one law for everybody in this country. Well, so we thought. I'm on time. In conclusion, and this is probably one of the first times I've had a talk that I'm going to be within time. Norms and standards are not uniform. The current one. There's a lacuna, there's a gap that exists for these free-ranging elephants and those on state land that are not protected areas. And we've got, other than the Defence Force, quite a few communal lands that are owned by the state. So therefore what? Well, the answer was to the department, they need to revise their norms and standards to address this gap, to bring uniformity. And they, duh. Well, what do we do about it? Well, my answer again was it's likely to be legally challenging to bring these free-roaming elephants under the norms and standards. And the ultimate conclusion is that the revision has to treat free-roaming elephants separately to those ones that are owned. So for the first time, we're going to have a bipolar set of norms and standards. And that bipolar has to take, the bipolar approach has to take into consideration the context in which the elephant finds itself in. So is it a transfrontier elephant? Because that's going to be treated very differently to free-roaming elephant on state land, and so on. And I didn't get my stop. But essentially, that's the recommendation to the norms and standards, is now to split it up. Because to change it, to try and now bring the free-roaming elephant into the current set is actually going to be disadvantageous or prejudicial to elephant. Because then areas are going to be chopped up. We're going to start isolating our farms from other areas. There we go, the stop sign. From our neighbouring countries and so on, which is not good for elephant conservation. Thanks very much.